Nick Vujicic's eyes and asked the question no one dared to voice. If you could have arms and legs right now, would you take them? Nick smiled and answered, no, because without my broken pieces, I would never know how beautiful a healed soul could be. In a world that judged them before they ever spoke, they turned their scars into something stronger than victory. What if everything you thought was broken was actually where your greatest strength begins? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights inside the studio softened to a gentle glow, washing the stage in a warm, forgiving haze. At the center sat Jasmine Crockett, still and composed, the deep blue of her suit catching the light like a quiet current of strength. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her fingers tracing slow, almost invisible movements. The kind of person makes when they are steadying themselves for something that matters. Around her, hundreds of faces filled the auditorium, but the room felt intimate, as if everyone had silently agreed to leave their judgment at the door. Above the stage, the words "Beyond the Surface" hung in clean, simple lettering. A reminder that tonight was not about appearances or headlines, but about something deeper. The walls seemed to lean inward, listening. Jasmine's face, so often a shield in the battles she fought, tonight allowed a sliver of vulnerability to show, a softness that had survived storms most could not imagine. She was not here to perform. She was here because there were truths that could only be spoken when everything else was stripped away. Then a shift, a ripple through the audience, as the announcer's voice, low and heavy with gravity, filled the hall. Please welcome a man born without arms and legs, yet carrying wings greater than any of us, Nick Vujicic. A second spotlight bloomed across the stage, revealing Nick in a tailored suit, perched atop a small platform. A radiant smile lighting up his face. No limbs, no concessions, just a soul too vast for any body to contain. For a long, suspended moment, the world seemed to forget itself. No scripts, no applause, just two souls acknowledging the miles they had each traveled to stand here, whole in ways the eye could never measure. Jasmine took a measured step forward, and then another, until she stood directly before Nick. She bowed her head, not dramatically, but in a way so sincere that the entire room seemed to bow with her. It was not the body she honored. It was the invisible battles, the nights no one saw, the endless, small choices to keep hoping when hope seemed a fool's errand. Nick's smile widened, not out of pride, but out of a deep, unshakable peace carved by years of refusing to let bitterness win. His voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering, every syllable pressing gently against the stillness. I am not here to tell you the story of my body. I am here to tell you the story of my soul. The words dropped like stones into a still lake, sending ripples of meaning across every corner of the room. Jasmine lifted her gaze to meet his, and for a heartbeat, there was no distance between them. Only the mutual recognition of two lives shaped by struggle, but not defined by it. Cameras clicked in the background, but even their flashes seemed muted, as if the machinery of the world understood that something more important was unfolding. Every heart in the room, every breath, waited on the next word, the next gesture, unwilling to break the spell. Nick paused, and in that pause, something almost invisible shifted, as if the air itself grew heavier, waiting for a wound to be opened that had never quite healed. When I was young, he began, his voice low but clear, I wasn't just different. I was something people looked at and then turned away from. He let the words sit there, not rushing to explain or soften them. They called me a monster, and though his voice did not rise, the word hit like a crack across a glass, sharp, immediate, irreversible. Behind him, the screen lit up with a grainy image, a small boy with no arms, no legs, tucked into himself on the cold tile of a school bathroom. His head bowed so tightly against his body that he seemed almost to disappear. The bathroom walls in the photo were stark and unforgiving, the kind that echoed every sound, every cruel whisper that had been hurled at him. Nick didn't look at the picture. His eyes stayed on the audience, steady, unblinking, as if daring them to look where others had once refused to. I hid in that bathroom for hours, he continued, because I didn't want to be reminded of what they saw when they looked at me. His voice tightened, just slightly, almost too small to catch, but enough to twist something deep inside everyone listening. And after a while, a terrible thing happened. I started to see myself the same way they did. The room remained frozen, as if breathing too loudly might shatter the fragile, brutal honesty hanging between them. Jasmine, still seated, lowered her gaze for a moment, her lashes wet, her fingers locking together as if holding on to something inside herself. Around them, hundreds of people sat utterly motionless, drawn into the terrible loneliness of that little boy on the floor, understanding perhaps, for the first time, that cruelty could sculpt a child's very sense of worth. Nick's face, illuminated gently by the stage lights, held no hatred, no accusation, only a quiet endurance that made every word heavier, more real. I wasn't hiding because I was afraid they'd hurt me, he said, his voice like a thread pulling taut. I was hiding because somewhere along the way, I started to believe that maybe they were right. His confession didn't explode into the room. It seeped into every corner, filling the spaces between ribs, making even the strongest listener feel suddenly, painfully small. And in that overwhelming quiet, it became heartbreakingly clear. The most dangerous wounds are not the ones the world sees. They are the ones it teaches you to carry inside yourself. The weight of Nick's last words did not simply drift away. It clung to the room like a second skin, a heavy, unseen hand pressing down on every chest. And it was Jasmine, sitting perfectly still beneath the heavy lights, who finally moved, her voice threading its way through the silence, fragile but unbroken. "What kept you breathing?" she asked, her voice trembling with a softness that somehow cut deeper than any shout. "When everything around you tried to suffocate you?" The question did not float gently. It landed with a sharp, aching thud, as if daring the air itself to answer. Nick didn't rush to speak. He only looked at her, his eyes steady, wide open, as if to say, you know because you've carried it too. That invisible weight of being unwanted before you even had a chance to become anything." Jasmine blinked against the heat rising behind her eyes, but she did not look away. She couldn't. Something between them had shifted. No longer two people sharing a stage, but two wounded histories reaching for each other across a chasm that the world had tried to carve wide and deep. And for a long moment, the audience wasn't watching a conversation. They were witnessing a collision of pasts in the fragile, flickering light of what survival really looked like. Jasmine drew a shaky breath, grounding herself against the wave of memory, clawing its way up from the dark corners she usually kept locked tight. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap moments ago, now twisted in a slow, unconscious rhythm, as if she were trying to wring the memory out of her own skin. "When I was 8, she began, her voice so soft it barely skimmed the microphone, "my teacher told the whole class that girls like me would never be anything but trouble." The word trouble hit the room differently. Not loud, not cruel, but heavy, inevitable. Like a door being slammed shut on a future before it ever had a chance to open. On the screen behind them, no photos appeared. Only the brutal clarity of feeling too small in a world that made no room for her. She described standing frozen in the middle of the classroom, the scratch of the chalk on the board louder than the laughter that began to bubble behind her, cruel and casual and unstoppable. She did not cry that day. She did not scream. She simply stood there and felt herself shrink inch by inch until it seemed there was no girl left. Only a label. Only a warning for others. "It felt," Jasmine said, her voice thick with the weight of it, "like the world had stamped something on my forehead that I could never erase." The lights softened almost imperceptibly, wrapping the stage in a muted, almost sacred glow, as if the universe itself understood that some truths needed gentler hands to hold them. No one in the audience moved. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. The story unfolding before them was not about politics or fame or even resilience. It was about the simple, devastating reality of being judged unworthy, long before you ever had the chance to prove otherwise. Jasmine's eyes glistened under the lights, but she did not wipe them. She let them stand. She let them be seen, because there was nothing weak about surviving a world that tried so hard to erase you. Across the stage, Nick watched her, not with pity, not even with sorrow, but with the kind of fierce, silent respect that can only be born from living through the same fire. And in that moment, two wounds, shaped in different bodies, carved by different knives, laid themselves bare, not for sympathy, but for something stronger: recognition. As Jasmine's last words dissolved into the heavy silence, Nick lowered his eyes. And for a fleeting second, the weight he carried seemed almost too much even for him. It wasn't the kind of pain that shouted. It was the quiet, familiar ache of an old wound reopening, raw and real beneath the polished surface. His voice, when it finally rose again, was soft, almost reluctant, as if dragging something into the open that had long preferred the dark. "I was 8 years old," Nick said, each word careful, deliberate, as though the memory might still break him if he spoke it too fast. "That was the first time I thought about ending it all." No gas this time, just a thick, stunned silence. A room full of people instinctively leaning closer without realizing they had moved. Nick's gaze didn't lift. He stayed fixed somewhere between the stage and a memory too vivid to blur with time. "I remember sitting by the bathtub," he continued, his voice threading through the stillness like smoke, "watching the water fill up, thinking, maybe if I just slid under, it would all stop." There was no anger in his tone, no self-pity, just the blunt, terrible honesty of a child trying to find a way out of a life he never asked for. "I didn't want to die with noise," Nick said, his words almost too soft to catch. "I wanted to fade away, like a soap bubble popping, no sound, no pain, just gone." The theater seemed to fold inward on itself, the walls pressing closer, the air growing so heavy it felt like a living thing. Jasmine's hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, as if holding herself together against the weight of his confession. Around them, no one shifted, no one coughed. It was as if even the cameras had forgotten to move, trapped in the awful intimacy of the moment. On the giant screen behind Nick, no image played, and none was needed. His voice painted it all with brutal clarity: a small boy, sitting alone at the edge of a tub, looking into the water not with fear, but with a kind of quiet resignation. "I thought," Nick said, his voice cracking just slightly for the first time, "that if I just disappeared, maybe the world would be better off." It wasn't just the cruelty of others that had driven him there. It was the way their words had hollowed him out from the inside, making him believe he was a burden simply for existing. And in that room full of strangers, something broke open. Not in Nick, but in the people who listened, realizing too late how easy it was for a society to crush a soul before it ever truly lived. As Nick's final words lingered in the heavy air, Jasmine sat frozen, the tears she had fought so long to control finally slipping free, cutting silent tracks down her face like rain falling through a broken roof. She didn't wipe them away. Instead, she leaned into the crack that had opened inside her, letting the rawness of it speak louder than anything she could have rehearsed. "I know that feeling," Jasmine said, her voice breaking and rebuilding itself in the same breath. "That feeling of not belonging anywhere, not because of who you are inside, but because of how the world chooses to see you." She inhaled sharply, the sound loud in the aching stillness. "Growing up black in America," she continued, her voice steadier now, "was like walking through a house where every door slammed shut before you even touched the handle." Around her, the audience stiffened, the brutal familiarity of her words hitting like an old wound torn open. Jasmine blinked hard, her fingers curling tightly into the fabric of her skirt, grounding herself against the rising tide of memory. "There were days," she whispered, "when I didn't feel like I belonged on this earth at all. when I thought maybe the world had been built for everyone except me. Her confession didn't ask for pity. It was a battle cry wrapped in brokenness, daring anyone listening to deny how deep injustice could carve itself into a soul. As Jasmine's final words trembled into silence, Nick shifted slightly in his seat, his body still but his eyes flickering with something older, something carved deeper than fresh wounds, the memory of a love that had fought for him before he even knew how to fight for himself. He inhaled slowly, not to calm himself, but to call up the strength needed to tell the part of the story that most people never asked to hear. Not the victories, not the stages, but the small wars fought behind closed doors, where love was not a feeling, but a relentless, daily choice. My mother, Nick said, his voice rough at the edges but unwavering, was the first person who refused to let me believe I was a mistake. The words didn't fall lightly. They thudded into the silence, heavy and deliberate, carrying the unseen weight of every moment the world had tried to crush him. She made me do everything, he continued, his mouth pulling into a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Even when everyone else said it was impossible, especially then. He paused, letting the memory fill the space between them, not rushing, not dressing it up, letting it be as hard and messy and real as it had been. She didn't just push me to survive, Nick said. She pushed me to live, to fight for a life that the world told me I didn't deserve. The screen behind him remained dark, as if even technology knew no image could capture the brutal tenderness he was unfolding. I remember one afternoon, Nick said, his voice growing softer, pulling the audience closer without asking. I came home from school, angry, exhausted, done. The children had called him names again. The teachers had looked away again. The world had reminded him again that he was less. And when I got home, Nick said, swallowing hard, I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to exist. He clenched his jaw for a moment, as if willing the words to stay clean, to stay survivable. But my mother, he continued, a flicker of wonder passing across his face even now. She didn't let me collapse into that feeling. Instead, she set a chair by the family computer. She placed a thick, heavy keyboard on the desk, the kind with keys you had to press down hard to make them register. And without saying a word, she nodded toward it. You will learn to type, she said. Nick laughed once, dry and broken. I looked at her like she had lost her mind, he said. I had no arms, no hands. How was I supposed to type? But she didn't explain. She didn't excuse. She simply stared at him, her face lined with a determination so fierce that it scared him more than the bullying or the loneliness ever had. So I tried, Nick said. His voice was so low now that the audience had to lean forward to catch every word. I fell. I failed. I got angry. I screamed at her. I begged her to stop. He blinked hard, once, twice, like someone shaking off the weight of invisible chains. And you know what she did? He said, the corner of his mouth pulling into something too deep to call a smile. She sat down on the floor right next to me, and she cried with me, but she didn't let me quit. The image was devastating in its simplicity, a small boy thrashing with rage and despair, two tiny toes fighting keys that weren't built for bodies like his, and a mother kneeling beside him, not with answers, not with apologies, but with a presence so fierce it became a kind of salvation. I don't remember the exact moment when I hit the first key, Nick said. I don't remember what word I spelled. He paused, and the silence around him thickening, deepening, pulling every soul in the room closer to the center of this small, defiant victory. But I remember the sound, Nick said, his voice catching now, raw and unfiltered. The click of that first letter. And the way my mother looked at me, like I had just split the world wide open. Across the auditorium, you could hear the faint sound of breaths being held, of hands gripping knees too tightly, of hearts breaking and rebuilding in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Nick didn't need to tell them the rest. He didn't need to list the typing competitions he would later win, or the speeches he would one day give with slides he had built himself. letter by painstaking letter. What mattered was that in a world that told him every day he was less, one woman had dared to tell him, to show him, that he was capable of everything. My mother, Nick said again, his voice almost a whisper now, taught me the hardest truth there is, that sometimes the ones who love you the most will also hurt with you the most. Not because they want to break you, but because they refuse to let you stay broken. He didn't bow his head after he said it. He didn't dramatize the moment. He simply let it hang there, a hard, beautiful truth, thrumming between every person in the room, a reminder that sometimes survival is a woman on a kitchen floor, crying beside her son, refusing to let him believe that the world gets to decide his worth. And in that heavy, reverent silence, dozens of people quietly wiped their eyes, their breath coming out in slow, unsteady waves, not because they had been entertained, but because they had been changed. As the memory of his mother's stubborn love faded gently into the charged silence, Nick shifted his weight slightly, his smile flickering into something sharper. A flash of defiance that hadn't been crushed, not even after everything. He tilted his head slightly, as if inviting the audience closer, not to witness another wound, but to feel the fire that somehow had survived beneath the scars. After a while, Nick said, his voice low but burning, I realized surviving wasn't enough. I needed to live. I needed to prove, mostly to myself, that I wasn't just alive because someone felt sorry for me. A murmur of agreement stirred through the audience, almost imperceptible, as if the truth of it had touched a nerve in every person sitting there. Nick's eyes gleamed under the lights, not with pride, but with the memory of a boy who had refused to stay where the world had placed him. And what better way, he continued, a crooked smile pulling at his mouth, than to try the one thing nobody thought I could ever do? He let the question hang there, a slow, electric pause that dragged the entire room into the next heartbeat. Soccer, he said simply. The audience stilled, almost confused, as if waiting for him to laugh it off. But Nick didn't laugh. He leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and sure. Yeah, soccer. The game of running, kicking, balance. All the things I didn't have. The absurdity of it made the air crackle, not with humor, but with a kind of stunned respect. I started practicing, Nick said, his voice dropping into a rhythm now, like a drum beat growing louder with each word. No coach, no fancy gear, just me, a ball, and a head that was a little harder than most. A few soft chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they died quickly as Nick continued, the steel in his voice unmistakable. I would roll the ball across the yard, launch myself at it, miss completely, crash to the ground, and get back up again and again and again. He paused, letting the picture form in their minds. A small boy, body low to the ground, hurling himself at a moving ball, while dirt and grass burned his skin, while the neighborhood kids stared and laughed, while every fall whispered the same brutal lie, give up. But I didn't, Nick said, and there was no boasting in his voice, only a simple, stubborn truth. I didn't stop because every time I fell, I told myself, falling was fine. Staying down wasn't. The screen behind him remained dark, but the silence in the room painted its own images. A boy bruised and scraped, struggling against a world that hadn't even bothered to offer him a rulebook he could play by. Nick's smile sharpened slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting with the memory of the day everything changed. One afternoon, we were playing after school, he said. The ball got kicked wild, rolling loose toward me, like it had forgotten I wasn't supposed to be part of the game. A few people in the audience leaned forward instinctively, caught in the gravity of the moment. I didn't think, Nick said, his voice tightening. I just threw myself at it. There was no choreography, no strategy, only instinct, and the burning need to be something other than invisible. My head hit the ball just right, he said, and his eyes shone now, alive with the memory. And it went flying straight into the goal. The room seemed to hold its breath as he spoke, as if trying to relive that impossible moment through his words. Nick laughed, a short, stunned sound, still amazed after all these years. There was this second, he said, this half second, where nobody moved, nobody spoke. They just stared at me, like the universe had cracked open and they weren't sure what they were seeing. And then, he said, the field exploded. Some kids cheering, some kids shouting, but all of them seeing him differently, even if just for a moment. They didn't clap because I was brave, Nick said, his voice low and sure. They clapped because for a split second, they forgot I wasn't supposed to be able to do that. He paused again, letting the enormity of that tiny victory settle like dust across the audience. I didn't just score a goal that day, Nick said, his voice so steady it felt almost sacred. I scored against everything they had ever assumed about me. I scored against destiny itself. The auditorium was silent, thick with the kind of reverence usually reserved for battlefields and funerals, the places where impossible fights are fought, without glory, without medals, but never forgotten. Nick didn't need to shout. He didn't need to beg them to understand. The story had already carved itself into the room, like a scar across soft wood. A boy with no arms and no legs, launching himself into a ball he was never meant to touch, changing not just the game, but the way everyone around him saw what was possible. And somewhere deep in the crowd, someone quietly began to weep, not out of sadness, but out of the unbearable, breathtaking weight of hope. As Nick's final words hung in the charged silence, the weight of what he had overcome pressed so hard against the room that it almost seemed to bow under it, until suddenly, from the heart of that stillness, a single broken laugh rose like sunlight breaking through a storm. Jasmine laughed, not the easy, polished laugh of a politician or a speaker filling dead air, but a laugh ripped straight from the deepest part of her chest, where grief and wonder had collided into something too big for silence. Tears streaked her face freely now, but she didn't move to hide them. They glistened under the harsh stage lights, like battle scars worn without shame. She leaned forward slightly, one hand pressed against her heart, as if physically trying to hold it together, and said, her voice shaking but fierce, "You didn't just score a goal, you scored against destiny." The words weren't thrown out lightly. They landed with the weight of every door slammed in Nick's face, every whisper that had tried to define his worth, before he even had a chance to choose it himself. For a moment, no one in the audience moved, caught in that rare, sacred space where truth had finally spoken itself aloud. Then, all at once, the room erupted, not in polite applause, but in a thunderous, rising wave of clapping and shouting that rattled the very air. Some laughed, sharp and breathless. Some wept openly, unable or unwilling to hide what had been cracked open inside them. The sound of it, the collision of laughter and tears, wasn't chaos. It was a kind of symphony, wild and perfect, born from witnessing the impossible made real. And in the center of it all stood Nick, smiling quietly, not as a man who had conquered a game, but as a man who had rewritten the rules without asking permission. As the last echoes of applause faded into a tender quiet, Nick stayed perfectly still, his chest rising slowly, as if he were gathering something fragile from deep inside. The grin that had lit up his face moments before softened into something heavier, something older, a memory that lived beneath the victories, the standing ovations, the endless flights and speeches. His eyes shifted slightly, not looking at anyone in particular, but somewhere just beyond the room, to a moment that had carved itself into him so deeply it had changed everything. "There's a story," Nick said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that I don't tell as often as I should." He paused, the room contracting around him, every ear straining for the next word. "It's not about when I stood on big stages," he said. "It's about when I stood on a small one, scared out of my mind." The confession was disarming, cutting clean through whatever polish or myth had begun to build around him. "It was my first real talk, 300 high school kids, and I honestly didn't know if I was strong enough to survive it. He let the weight of that settle before going on, his voice steady but bruised with memory. When I rolled out onto that gymnasium floor, I could feel it, he said. The stares, the whispers, the kids who looked away because they didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, cold and indifferent, casting everything in that ugly, flat brightness that made flaws impossible to hide. Folding chairs scraped against the polished wood floor, sneakers squeaked, teachers leaned against the walls, arms crossed, faces politely blank. Nick swallowed hard at the memory, his throat working visibly. I felt like every insecurity I had ever carried was sitting there with me, he said, louder than the microphone, heavier than the stage. And yet, somehow, he had begun to speak. Not because he felt ready, but because he knew if he didn't, the silence might drown him. I told them everything, Nick said. No filters, no gloss, just the stripped-down truth of what it meant to live every day inside a body the world had called a mistake. At first, the room had been restless, a tide of shifting feet and muffled coughs and impatient glances at the clock. But slowly, painfully, the current began to change. Nick could feel it before he could see it, the way you feel a storm building in the pit of your stomach. There was this moment, he said, his voice shaking slightly now, where I realized they weren't seeing the body anymore. They were hearing the heart. He described it, the way the gym seemed to shrink, the way the fluorescent light seemed to fade, leaving only the trembling connection between one soul standing and 300 others seated, breathing together in the dark. I told them about the nights I cried myself to sleep, Nick said, about the times I wanted to slip beneath the bathwater and never come up. His words didn't fall like grand declarations. They broke like waves against a shore battered by too many storms, relentless but soft in their devastation. When the talk ended, there wasn't much applause. No standing ovations, no TV cameras waiting backstage, just a slow, heavy silence as 300 students filed out into the afternoon light, carrying pieces of his story stitched into the spaces behind their ribs. Nick stayed behind, exhausted, unsure whether he had changed anything at all. He was gathering his notes, ready to retreat into the familiar loneliness that often followed even his most honest moments when he felt a tap, light, hesitant, on his shoulder. He turned. 3 students stood there, arms crossed tightly over their chests, their faces pale, their eyes shimmering with the kind of pain that doesn't have to be explained. They told me, Nick said, his voice cracking hard, that they had planned to end their lives that week. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the memory too large to contain neatly even after all these years. They told me they chose to stay because of what I said. He didn't embellish it. He didn't try to make it sound heroic. He just let it exist, raw and beautiful and unbearably heavy. 3 lives hanging by threads Nick hadn't even known he could reach had decided not to slip away into the quiet because someone had stood in front of them and bared his brokenness without apology. Nick's voice dropped even lower, so low that the room seemed to lean into him instinctively. I didn't save them, he said. They saved themselves. But maybe I showed them that broken things can still be strong enough to carry light. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the terrible, wonderful truth that sometimes survival isn't about grand victories or perfect speeches. Sometimes survival is just about staying one more day because someone else's story reminds you that you can. The weight of Nick's last words didn't lift from the room. It thickened, settling deep into the lungs of every person present until breathing itself felt like an act of reverence. Jasmine didn't speak at first. She simply moved, slowly, deliberately, across the inches that separated them, her hand reaching out as if guided by something older and deeper than conscious thought. Her fingers found his shoulder, light but unwavering, and the touch alone said more than any speech could have. She gripped him, not to steady him, but to steady herself, anchoring both of them in the unbearable truth that survival, real survival, was something no one could achieve alone. Her hand trembled slightly against him, Not from fear, but from the overwhelming force of recognition. The knowledge that she was not just witnessing his story, but standing inside it, side by side with every invisible wound he had laid bare. Her eyes, glossy with tears, she no longer tried to blink away, locked onto his. And in a voice so soft yet so powerful, it seemed to rearrange the very molecules in the air, Jasmine said, "You became their last hope and their first light." The words didn't break the silence. They transformed it, turning the heavy, aching quiet into something fragile, sacred, and alive. The moment stretched long enough for the world outside the room to fall away completely, leaving only the two of them suspended between everything they had survived and everything they had chosen to believe anyway. Behind them, the massive screen flickered to life, washing the stage in a muted golden glow that made the whole scene feel less like a broadcast and more like a memory you could step into. Grainy footage filled the screen, shaky, unpolished, brutally real, of teenagers flooding forward after Nick's first real speech, their faces red with tears, their hands reaching not for the celebrity, but for the survivor. One by one, they collapsed against him, clinging to the small, steady force he had become without ever meaning to. Nick didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He leaned into them, receiving their pain, their relief, their trembling hope, as if it were a sacred offering too precious to be refused. The audience in the theater watched, unmoving, their own breathing shallow as the footage showed arms wrapped desperately around a man who had once sat by a bathtub at 8 years old, thinking about disappearing. And now here he was, not vanished, not broken, but standing as a lighthouse for every soul that had ever believed they were too lost to save. Jasmine squeezed his shoulder a little tighter, grounding herself against the enormity of the history passing between them. She didn't speak again. There were no more words big enough. She only stayed there, one woman anchoring another, one survivor steadying another, both of them wrapped in the heavy, trembling silence of those who understood too intimately that some victories don't come with parades or medals. Some victories look like a broken boy choosing not to drown. Some victories look like a child whispering, "I'll stay," into a life they once wanted to leave. And some victories look like a room full of strangers holding their breath, witnessing the unbearable beauty of survival stitched into the smallest, bravest acts of connection. The stage still pulsed with the raw electricity of unspoken pain and silent victories when Jasmine, her voice shaking but unflinching, leaned closer to Nick, as if daring to touch the most fragile question neither of them had spoken aloud until now. "If you could have arms and legs right now," she asked, her voice catching slightly against the gravity of the words, "would you take them?" The question didn't land lightly. It hit like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the fragile quiet that hung between them. Jasmine didn't ask it out of pity or curiosity. She asked it because somewhere deep inside her, she already knew the cost of survival wasn't measured in what you had, but in what you chose to carry. Nick didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile forming at the edges of his mouth. A smile forged not from happiness, but from a kind of battle-hardened peace. His eyes didn't flicker away from hers. He met her gaze full on, steady and calm, as if the weight of the question itself was something he had already lifted, carried, and made peace with long ago. The pause stretched long enough for every person in the audience to feel the breathlessness of it, the sharp awareness that they were standing on the edge of a cliff inside his heart. And then quietly, without theatrics or self-pity, Nick said, "No. Because without my broken pieces, I would never know how beautiful a healed soul could be." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They dropped like stones into the room, sinking so deeply that for a long, suspended heartbeat, no one, not even the cameras, dared to move. Jasmine's eyes filled instantly, tears trembling on the brink but refusing to fall, as if even her body understood that this moment wasn't meant to be blurred by anything, not even grief. She drew in a shaky breath, pressing her hand to her chest, feeling the weight of his answer settle there like a second heartbeat. Across the theater, the audience sat frozen, an ocean of faces caught in the kind of stillness usually reserved for prayers, for final goodbyes, for witnessing miracles too delicate to survive loudness. Some people covered their mouths with their hands, others closed their eyes tightly, as if trying to memorize the feeling of hearing something so pure that it stripped them of every easy comfort they had ever clung to. A man in the second row wiped at his eyes roughly, embarrassed by how quickly the words had broken through his carefully constructed walls. A young woman near the aisle pressed her forehead to her knees, her shoulders shaking silently. There were no whispers, no rustling of programs, no coughs, only the shared, trembling silence of people remembering every broken place they had hidden from themselves. Nick remained completely still, his body at peace in a way that only someone who had fought and bled and made peace with his own fractures could achieve. He didn't rush to explain or soften his answer. He didn't offer an apology for it. He just let it exist, full and heavy and unashamed, daring everyone watching to sit inside the discomfort it created and to see the beauty in it. For a moment, the bright stage lights seemed to dim, or maybe it was just that the weight of truth had eclipsed everything else. Jasmine reached for his hand again, not with urgency but with reverence, her fingers wrapping gently around the place where the world would have said there was nothing to hold. Nick smiled at her, a smile that spoke not of victory, but of the kind of wholeness that only brokenness could teach. And for the first time all night, the audience didn't just see Nick Vujicic. They saw themselves, every cracked, imperfect part of themselves, reflected back at them through a man who had been told he was less and had become more than anyone had dared to imagine. When the first sob broke the silence, it didn't shatter the moment. It deepened it. A woman in the front row gasped softly, pressing a shaking hand to her mouth, and the sound gave permission for the dam to break wide open. Tears flowed freely now. Not the polite kind that come from well-told stories or neatly packaged inspiration, but the raw, gutting kind that rise from the deepest places, the places where people hide the parts of themselves they think can never be loved. People clutched at their chests, at each other, at nothing at all, as if trying to hold together something that had just been torn wide open. The sound was not chaotic. It was almost symphonic. A low, aching hum of human hearts, remembering they were allowed to hurt and heal at the same time. And in the center of it all sat Nick, unshaken, unmoved, radiating a stillness so profound that it felt less like defiance and more like a kind of quiet benediction. Jasmine wiped at her face once, then let her hand fall, her shoulders trembling, but her spine impossibly straight. She looked at Nick, not as someone who had been broken, but as someone who had been reforged into something stronger, something rarer than any unscarred life could ever hope to be. The screen behind them remained frozen on the earlier footage. The image of children clinging to Nick, faces buried against him, desperate not to let go. And it felt as if the past and the present had folded into each other, looping endlessly through every person who had ever needed to believe that brokenness did not disqualify them from light. It made every beating heart in the room feel stitched together by something older than pain and stronger than despair. And for one long, endless minute, no one moved. No one needed to. Because some truths don't need noise to be heard. Some truths only need silence and the courage to sit inside it. As the silence wrapped itself around the room, trembling with the weight of everything Nick had laid bare, Jasmine inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening briefly in her lap before she let the truth she had carried for so long finally break through the dam of composure. "There are days," Jasmine said, her voice low but clear, slicing through the heavy stillness like a blade wrapped in velvet, "when I stand on the floor of Congress, fighting for people who look like me, who sound like me, and I feel like I have no arms, no legs, nothing to hold on to." She didn't look away as she spoke. Her gaze remained locked forward, daring the world to flinch first. Because no matter how loud my voice is, no matter how carefully I build my arguments, I can see it in their faces. The ones who smile politely but never hear a word I say. The ones who have already decided what I am before I open my mouth. Her hands resting on her knees, curled slowly into fists. Not in anger, but in an aching, relentless attempt to keep herself from unraveling right there under the lights. "There are days," Jasmine continued, her voice tightening against the swell of emotion rising in her chest. When I feel like I'm swinging at the air, like I'm fighting battles that were lost long before I ever arrived. She exhaled a shaky breath, and for a moment it felt like the whole theater exhaled with her, recognizing the invisible, grinding war she fought every time she dared to take up space. And sometimes, she said, her voice cracking in the middle, I wonder if my voice is enough, if it was ever meant to be enough. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply sat there, carved in raw defiance and fragile truth, daring the world to look at her and not blink. For a long moment, Nick said nothing. He simply looked at her. Not with pity, not with easy sympathy, but with the fierce, steady gaze of someone who understood what it meant to fight wars you didn't choose inside rooms that were never built for you. Then quietly, with a gentleness so profound it cracked the air, Nick said, "But your voice is your wings, Jasmine. Never fold them." The words didn't crash into the room. They floated down like ash from a fire still burning somewhere deep and unextinguished. And somehow they hit harder than any shout could have, because they came from someone who knew exactly what it meant to build a life out of pieces the world tried to convince you were useless. Jasmine's breath hit sharply at the simple, devastating beauty of it, her body visibly bracing against the full impact of what he had just handed her. Permission. Permission not just to keep speaking, but to believe that every broken, bruised word was part of something bigger than the walls she fought against. Slowly, almost reverently, she reached across the small distance between them, her fingers seeking his, and Nick, without hesitation, met her halfway. Their hands found each other, imperfect, incomplete, and yet somehow, when joined, more whole than anything the world had ever tried to build without them. It wasn't a handshake. It wasn't a photo opportunity. It was something elemental, something ancient, the kind of connection that doesn't require language to be understood. Around them, the audience watched in breathless silence, every eye fixed on the two figures who, against every odd, every insult, every locked door and broken bone, had carved out a space where survival was no longer the goal, but transformation. The screen behind them, still frozen on the image of teenagers clinging to Nick after his speech, seemed almost to pulse with life, as if it too recognized that this moment was no longer about brokenness. It was about what happens when broken things find each other and realize they were never broken at all, just unfinished. The lights overhead softened almost imperceptibly, casting a warm, golden hue across the stage that made Jasmine and Nick seem less like two people and more like twin flames burning against the long, cold dark. No one clapped. No one moved. The air itself seemed to kneel around them, reverent and trembling, as if even time understood it needed to slow down and witness what was happening. Because what they had built, in the slow, painful layering of wound upon wound, courage upon courage, was not a moment for applause. It was a monument to what it means to survive without permission, to speak without apology, to love a broken world with hands that had been told they would never hold anything at all. Jasmine squeezed Nick's hand once, firm, sure, unflinching, and he squeezed back, a silent pact sealed not by words, but by the shared knowledge of what it costs to stay standing when the world prefers you silent or gone. And in that small, defiant, incandescent moment, two wounded souls carried the weight of every person who had ever been told they were too broken, too different, too much, and they carried it like a crown. As the weight of their silent pact hung in the charged air, a wordless understanding blooming between them, Jasmine and Nick turned toward each other, not as speaker and audience, not as survivor and supporter, but as two warriors who had recognized the battles carved into each other's bones. Jasmine rose first, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each step forward was a reclaiming of something the world had tried to steal from her. Nick shifted his chair toward her, not with urgency, but with a grace so natural it seemed to dissolve the line between motion and intention. Their eyes met fully now, without armor, without hesitation. A collision of spirits battered by the storms of judgment, but somehow still burning, still reaching. Jasmine bent slightly, opening her arms not in pity, but in honor, and Nick leaned into her without a moment's pause. Their embrace was not gentle. It was fierce, aching, the kind of hold that says, I see you, I carry you, I choose you anyway. Jasmine's face pressed lightly against Nick's shoulder, her body trembling with the force of everything she had kept sealed for too long. Nick's head tilted into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as if to drink in the rare, sacred weight of being held not as broken, but as whole. The room around them blurred, the lights, the cameras, the sea of faces, until there was nothing left but the electric, trembling thrum of two hearts refusing to surrender. The hug didn't break quickly. It lingered, stretching time itself, until the audience too seemed to fold into it, breathing with them, weeping with them, daring to hope with them. It was the kind of embrace that made you believe, even for just a second, that pain could be transmuted, that survival could become sanctuary. It wasn't polished for TV. It wasn't rehearsed for applause. It was messy, raw, human, and therefore it was perfect. When Jasmine finally pulled back, she kept her hands on Nick's shoulders, grounding them both in the reality of what they had built together, stone by stubborn stone. And Nick, lifting his head to meet the full, broken, and burning gaze of every soul in that room, spoke, not loudly but with a quiet that roared. You don't need arms to embrace the world, he said, his voice steady, almost unbearably tender. You only need a heart wide enough to hold it. The words didn't just land. They cracked open something ancient and hidden inside every person in that room. For a second, the world tilted, not in chaos but in realignment, as if the broken pieces inside each chest had found each other again, stitching themselves together in the simple, brutal miracle of understanding. And then, without a cue, without a signal, the audience rose to their feet, not with the sharp, programmed standing ovation of television tapings, but with the slow, unstoppable gravity of people who had been changed down to the marrow of their bones. The applause started small, a scattered scattering of claps that sounded almost shy against the enormity of what had just happened. But it grew, louder, richer, fuller, a rolling thunder of hands coming together not in celebration, but in reverence. Some clapped with tears streaming down their faces, others clapped with fists curled tight at their sides, as if trying to punch their gratitude into the air itself. There were no words shouted, no slogans chanted, only the relentless, trembling sound of people trying to honor something too big, too holy, to be captured in language. As the applause swelled, the cameras, those cold, mechanical observers, moved almost reverently across the rows of faces. They captured it all. The old man in the front row, dabbing at his eyes with a trembling hand, the teenage girl clutching her mother's arm, her mouth open in a silent sob, the polished executive wiping his nose against the sleeve of his designer jacket, caring nothing for the optics. And sprinkled between the tears were the smiles. Raw, cracked open, radiant smiles. The kind that can only come after witnessing something that both breaks you and stitches you back together in the same breath. The kind of smiles that don't hide the pain, but honor it. The kind of smiles that understand that surviving isn't always neat, but it is always, always sacred. The camera lingered on Jasmine and Nick, still standing together in the center of it all. Two unlikely architects of a cathedral built not from stone or steel, but from scars, from voices, from the stubborn, blazing refusal to be less than whole. They didn't bow. They didn't wave. They simply stood there, hands clasped, hearts open, letting the moment wash over them, through them, into the endless spaces where hope had been waiting all along. Nick leaned closer, just slightly, and whispered something only Jasmine could hear. She nodded once, her eyes shining but clear, as if anchoring the words inside her ribcage forever. The applause didn't fade quickly. It surged and receded like the tide, again and again, a living testament to the fact that what had been built in that room would not be easily forgotten. Long after the lights dimmed, long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the polished news clips boiled it all down to a few sound bites, the people who had been there would remember. They would remember what it felt like when two broken warriors stood on a stage and reminded them that brokenness was not the end. It was the beginning. And as the final shot zoomed out, sweeping over a sea of shining faces, of hands still clapping, of bodies still trembling with the terrible, beautiful weight of being alive, the screen faded to black, but the light they had ignited burned on. As the lights dimmed and the final applause dissolved into a heavy, aching quiet, the lessons carved into the night did not vanish. They deepened, thickened, settling into every heart like seeds planted in soil torn open by truth. The story of Nick and Jasmine wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about defying odds or outlasting cruelty. It was about the invisible wars most people never see, the brutal daily battles fought inside bodies and systems designed to erase you. It was about refusing to let the world's blindness define your worth, about dragging your broken pieces into the light and daring to build something sacred from them. The injustice Nick faced, being seen as incomplete, as less than, wasn't unique to disability. It was the same rot that told Jasmine she was too loud, too angry, too different to deserve a seat at the table. And yet both of them, battered and bloodied by the systems meant to silence them, chose not just to survive, but to sing, to fight, to stay. They had become living proof that brokenness was not the opposite of strength. It was the birthplace of it. And in doing so, they offered every person watching something rarer than hope, permission to believe that they too were enough. Their stories collided at the intersection of two brutal truths, that the world is often merciless, and that beauty often rises not despite that mercilessness, but because of it. Nick's body had been judged before he could speak his first word. Jasmine's voice had been dismissed before she could finish her first sentence. Every door they knocked on had been weighted against them, every battle fought uphill, every victory laced with the sour taste of battles still unwon. And still they rose, still they fought, still they believed that a world built on exclusion could be challenged, cracked, remade. Their lives became a roadmap not for easy triumphs, but for necessary ones. The kind built one trembling step at a time. The kind forged when you learned to build wings from the ashes of every bridge burned behind you. And in standing there, bruised but unbroken, scarred but shining, they reminded everyone watching that endurance was not passive, it was an act of rebellion, it was an act of love. What Jasmine and Nick taught was not that pain disappears if you work hard enough. It was that pain, if carried with courage, could become a weapon sharper than any prejudice, stronger than any fear. They didn't preach about resilience as a shiny, marketable virtue. They bled it, lived it, breathed it into every word, every glance, every trembling breath they offered that stage. They showed that to survive injustice is not just to endure. It is to spit in the face of every hand that tried to crush you, to build beauty from rubble and dare the world to see you shine. They showed that anger, when rooted in love, becomes fuel, that grief, when honored, becomes wisdom, that brokenness, when embraced, becomes the fiercest kind of freedom. And they showed that the most radical act in a world that profits from your silence is simply to keep speaking. The talk show didn't end in neat platitudes or marketable slogans. It ended in something harder, messier, and infinitely more real. The acknowledgement that injustice scars you, yes, but it also gives you a map of where to build. That loss hollow you out, yes, but it also carves space for new life. That sometimes surviving a world that wants you smaller is the most profound act of creation you can offer. Jasmine and Nick didn't teach the audience how to avoid pain. They taught them how to make something holy from it. They didn't promise that battles would be easy, or fair, or even winnable. They promised only that the fight was still worth it, and that somewhere in the shattered places inside each of us, light could still take root. As the credits rolled and the audience filed out into the cool night, the lessons didn't fade with the lights. They clung to people's skin, their clothes, their breath, a weight both unbearable and impossible to surrender. Mothers held their children closer, understanding now that strength wasn't something you could see. Fathers wiped their eyes and straightened their shoulders, wondering how many times they had mistaken vulnerability for weakness. Young girls and boys left the theater standing a little taller, their scars not erased but honored. Somewhere deep inside them, a new truth had been planted, that the world might never make space for them, but they could still take it. That they might be told they were too broken, too different, too much, but they could still build wings from the pieces. That they might never be handed the life they deserved, but they could still create a life worth living. Because the final searing truth that Nick and Jasmine offered wasn't that they were heroes. It was that heroism is not reserved for the unbroken. It lives in the trembling voice that speaks anyway. It lives in the scarred hands that keep building. It lives in every battered, bleeding heart that dares to stay open in a world that profits from shutting us down. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point all along. Not to erase the brokenness, not to hide the scars, but to wear them openly, proudly, as proof that even shattered things can shine. And in the end, as the last echoes of their words faded into the starlit sky, what remained wasn't sadness or pity or even simple hope. What remained was the knowledge that every broken heart still beating was itself a revolution, and that maybe, just maybe, the world didn't need perfect people to be saved. It needed the broken, the bruised, the ones who stayed anyway. It needed us. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.